All right, it's Ramsey Dewey over here in Shanghai, China. Today, we have the distinction of speaking with Zack Telander, Olympic weightlifting coach, and also newly a practitioner of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So, Zack, how did you get into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and how long ago was that?
Well, I've always been a fan of MMA, and it's just because it's such a popular sport. And I think it was like 2 years ago, I did a trial week of BJJ back where I used to live in College Station, but I never was really able to follow through with it because I was always training for weightlifting. I just realized like I can't maximize my time in either one of them. So I just was like, you know what, I'm going to go back to weightlifting. Later on, when I decide to stop weightlifting, I'm going to definitely pursue this because I really enjoy it. So my understanding of the sport, it's much deeper than my own practicing and training of it. And I think about like 11 or 12 weeks ago, maybe even less than that. I think I'm on my like 10th week, maybe. I'm not entirely sure. I basically was like, this is that time. I'm taking a step back and competing in weightlifting. I have a lot of people that I coach, a lot of guys who are at the national level here in the States. And so I decided to pursue jiu-jitsu again. One of my buddies came out to visit me, and he's been doing jiu-jitsu, and he's like, we got to go train. And I was like, all right. So there's actually a gym that's like 10 minutes away from here. And it just so happens to be the gym with Kody Steele and William Tackett and Andrew Tackett. And the professor there, his name's Rodrigo Cabral. And
okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just a very, very solid gym with guys who train very, very hard.
Yeah, man. Those are some names. Those are some names in the sport, man. That's that is fascinating.
Yeah. So I've only really been practicing hard for like I said, probably 10 weeks now.
All right. So 10 weeks of jiu-jitsu training, and we're going to talk about jiu-jitsu and strength training, weightlifting, becoming a better athlete, all those great things. Zack is an Olympic weightlifting coach. Now, this is the third time we've tried this call. We had some connection problems because I'm over here in China, and the Great Firewall of China hates communication with the outside world, apparently. But I'd like to start this out taking it in a little bit different direction, because when I read through my YouTube comments, I realize that not everybody is well versed in what being an Olympic weightlifter is versus other types of strength athletes. So really quickly, could you put it in as simple terms as possible? Like, what's the difference between an Olympic weightlifter, a power lifter, a strongman, a bodybuilder, and your average gym bro, if you will?
Well, so it's commonly called Olympic weightlifting, but it's somewhat of a misnomer because it's really just called the sport of weightlifting. And because we don't just perform it in the Olympics, it just so happens to be the only real strength sport in the Olympics. There's two movements called the snatch and the clean and jerk. They're done with a barbell and bumpers, which many people many people know what those pieces of equipment are. And the snatch is just one movement from the ground to overhead without stopping at the shoulders. And the clean and jerk, you stop at the shoulders. The difference between that and powerlifting deals with bench, squat, and deadlift. Strongman deals with a multitude of equipment and other strength sports that I would say fit into that. Maybe something like CrossFit. They're just less specific to those two movements. So in weightlifting, we try to have the perfect balance of power and strength, and a ton of mobility and a ton of different things that are demanded of us just to do two very specific movements, and those are the snatch and the clean and jerk.
So you specifically are an Olympic weightlifting coach, or simply put, yes, a weightlifting coach. Now, recently, you put out a video where you did a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu roll. You rolled. That's sparring in Jiu-Jitsu for those who may not be familiar with that term. with Kody Steele, a jiu-jitsu black belt, and you've been training for a fairly limited time in jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
I mean, when I checked the internet, it says you were a one-stripe white belt in jiu-jitsu. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. I've been training for about 10 weeks now, and the gym that I've been training at has a lot of very, very high-level jiu-jitsu practitioners and competitors. But I think, before that, I've had an understanding of the sport. So I think a lot of people who are introduced to grappling, you have to understand the game to play the game, and that might take months. And I really expedited that process because of my interest in jiu-jitsu and mixed martial arts in general. Before even getting on the mats, I knew what it was. I knew most of the ideas behind it, or the very basic ideas. So I was able to, like I said, expedite that process and start training very hard almost immediately.
Yeah, and that was definitely visible in that video, in that grappling video. As a coach of combat sports athletes, and also as a coach of average people who come in to take a class for fun, for recreation, and for fitness, I do both. It's quite interesting to see the difference between, say, an average person and an elite level athlete coming from a different and sometimes a related sport, and how that translates over to combat sports. So I did some commentary on that video, and a ton of people in the comments said, no way, Zack must have had years of wrestling, probably wrestled in college. I mean, I see the way he moves. I saw his hand fighting. Do you have any wrestling experience? Like outside of your training?
In fifth grade. So I was like 10 years old. So
okay.
that's 20 years ago. And I literally, all I remember was like a single leg and a double leg. But I'd say I would actually attribute any ability that I have in single legs or double legs to tackling in football.
Okay.
Yeah. So I really, really don't have any grappling experience prior to these 10 weeks.
I do want to clarify a few things about that rule. You did send me a message about it, and obviously the two of you weren't trying to kill each other or win any gold medals at a tournament. It seemed to be more of an educational type of exercise. Could you tell us a little bit about that rule from your perspective?
Yeah. So I don't know how it is at most gyms. I figure it's the same, but it's not that you're required to roll with the upper belts. It's just that it's something that I consistently do. And I roll with all of the black belts, all of the brown belts, all of the purple belts. I roll with pretty much everyone. And I actually very rarely roll with other white belts. When I roll with Kody, he's very, very good at like pushing me and giving me really good looks. And he'll go hard. He'll do situational type of stuff because I'm bigger and because I'm stronger and I have some athleticism. I actually can help him out in that way. Like having a guy who, if he's 170 pounds and I'm 230, that's a 60-pound difference. And I'm stronger than Kody as well. So he has fun with it. In that particular role, Kody just wanted to, stand and bang. Like that's it. He wanted to just stand and come towards me constantly. Just never stop coming at me. And you can definitely see it in the video. Like he's always moving forward, always, always, always. And so
yeah, that was a really fun role to watch, actually. Like a lot of roles are kind of confusing and kind of boring to the average person, but to me that was a lot of fun to watch, just seeing both of you get after it.
Yeah, and so like yesterday, just sorry to cut you off, but yesterday we rolled and we were in the gi, and it was much more like of a classic roll. And again, he's kind of he's messing around, he's practicing things, but we did something crazy. We were doing actually 10-minute rounds. And I know that people think like my fitness looked horrible, compared to the average guy, but Kody is not average. His fitness level is some of the best that I've seen in strength and conditioning as a coach in my entire career. So yesterday we did 10-minute rolls and in the gi, and these were more, these were completely ground based. And, I was able to just kind of move with him and never really have that point where I have to go throw up in a garbage can. But he submitted me like 5 or 6 times in 10 minutes, so
yeah, man.
It's that the reality is like, oh, this really strong guy came into the sport and gave this guy a run for his money. I think what people need to understand is this new guy came into the sport and showed that he has defense, he has some offense, and he understands the sport and is able to use his body to move through it, rather than just be completely unaware of what to do and have Kody with almost zero effort do whatever he wants.
Man, so there's a 60-pound difference between the two of you, right? Now,
Yes.
one thing that it sounds totally obvious to the average person, I think, which is that size and strength matter in a fight, in pretty much any athletic endeavor. It matters. Like every athletic attribute matters. But many, many martial artists from many, many disciplines have been indoctrinated in this idea that size and strength don't matter, or that the right amount of technique will always insurmountably make up for any lack of athleticism. And I find this is...
Yeah, it's just not nuanced enough. It's just...
Yes.
It's an absolute answer to a not, something that cannot have absolute answers.
Yes, exactly. And that's one thing I'd like to do with this discussion is get into the nuances. Like,
right.
The point of that video wasn't to point out that strength is better than technique, or technique is better than strength. It's that all serious combat sports athletes, all serious martial artists should focus on improving their athletic attributes, improving their strength training, learning how to move better, being more flexible, all of these things that should sound really obvious, but again, many very well-intentioned martial artists tend to ignore in favor of the idea of the magic technique that's going to save them.
So here's and I'm glad you kind of brought this up. One of the things that I saw in the comments that was continually missed was the actual psychology. So what I've kind of outlined here for you, Ramsey, is a couple of different things. And the first thing I would say is called, like, what I'm just going to call the Triad of Performance. And so in this triad, the one that we're missing is psychology, the one that people missed in the comment section, and then they kind of skip over. And it kind of, without that third piece, the triangle, you can still be a decent practitioner in any sport, but you'll never allow yourself to improve at a certain point, and you'll never be elite. And so that triad is physiology. And so that's your output. That's strength, that's fitness, and that's power. Then you have specificity. Specificity, that's just technique. What are your demands of your sport? And again, not physically, not psychologically. This one is now a learned understanding of your sport. And what's interesting about technique, and I think this is what people are drawn to in technique, is that it's a lot less about genetic disposition, at least in the sense of many other athletic endeavors. It is more about practice. And because a great example of this is like learning how to do a triangle from closed guard. It's actually not difficult at all. The steps of doing a triangle, most humans can just do a triangle if a coach is right there walking them through every single step. Most humans,
it's mechanically simple.
Yes. And so if we look at jiu-jitsu in this way, almost everything is mechanically simple. We're not doing gymnastics here, right? Like, so when we talk about technique and specificity in that way, what we're really saying is, here's a very simple movement that takes a lot of steps, And it's what's difficult about it is knowing those steps in and out, like it's a language to you, right? And being able to do them wherever and whenever. The person who can throw up the triangle very fast and cinch it up and have all the other steps in line just in the back of their head, that's a technical person, but that's not always the most athletic person. That's not always the strongest person. That's not always the most gritty and other psychological factors. So that's what I would say is the other piece of the triad is specificity. The last one is psychology. And this one is the most not most important, but it's the most overlooked, especially in your comment section, right? So psychology is, there's a couple of that I wrote here, but I would say humility is a good determination, because humility will allow you to take your ego aside and not focus on goals, but focus on process, right? When you take your ego out of it, you have zero expectations and you can only focus on the highest standard of movement. So that's my biggest thing, is like have very low expectations, but have very high standards. Until you have proven yourself otherwise, there's no reason to expect anything. So that's a huge one, humility. Then there's grit, which is just, it's a very overarching term, but you would say your ability to fight through any sort of setbacks. And then you would have determination, which would follow into that. So those three pieces are absolutely necessary to develop in an athlete. And what I think people think is, if you have two of those three, you can be an incredibly good jiu-jitsu practitioner. I'd say better than the average, much better than the average. But you will lose to the person that has three. And furthermore, if you have two of those pieces, say that you have specificity and psychology, which is technique and the other psychological factors, if you have gotten very good at those, you might get beat by the guy who has the physiology advantages and has specificity, or he has the physiology and he has the grit and the determination. You might lose to that person. However, if you have all three of those things, you will not lose to that person. So I'll give you an example. Let's say that, and I think that at my level right now, I'd say my psychology and my physiology are pretty good. And if I have someone who has almost an equal level of specificity and psychology, or specificity and physiology, I will give them a run for their money. Again, that's equal levels, even though they're the opposite parts of the triangle. And so the main one that we're missing in this discussion is the psychology. And I have a couple other kind of offshoots of that, if you want to dive into those. Please,
by all means. This is super interesting to me.
So psychologically, and this is, I actually brought this up in our private discussion. Something that we see a lot in jiu-jitsu is what people call the blue belt blues, and that is the retention of blue belts is very, very difficult. It's obviously the biggest belt is white belt as far as the amount of people that join the sport. And then making it beyond white belt is probably the hardest, even though people think making it furthermore, just as far as numbers go, right? Yeah. Once you get to blue belt, there's a substantial drop off before making it to purple belt, a substantial one. And this is something that's widely known in the jiu-jitsu community. However,
that's true. There are always going to be more blue belts than purple belts, always.
This phenomena, though, I would argue is in a lot of different, I don't want to say hobbyist, but sports that are popular that maybe aren't done as youth. And my sport of weightlifting is one of those sports. So what do we see when we get the blue belt blues? We see, as a white belt, like I was saying before, you're learning to play the game. If you don't know what jiu-jitsu is, you can't play it. So just knowing what it is, like here's close guard. Here's passing guard. Here are some submissions. Here's side control, which is a dominant position. Here's mount, which is a dominant position. Here's a back take. Here are this is
not
how
a pick up and
works.
play type of game, right?
Yes, this is how these position works. This is your objective. That might take a month for someone to just understand, right?
Yeah. At a crucial level.
Yes. Okay. So just understanding what that is might take some time. Then understanding each position and how they systematically work with them. Well, now you're talking another 8 months, another year. Okay. Then some submissions on top of that, maybe adding in defense to submissions, certain things like that. That might be another year. Okay. The entire time as a white belt, you're surviving. It's as simple as that. You're just surviving. Okay.
So
but
true.
you're learning. And if you have the humility to allow yourself to be beaten, to have all these things, if you allow yourself that humility, you feel very good about training every day because you actually are noticeably getting better every day. And there's another principle we'll talk about a little bit later, and we're going to call that adaptive resistance. But that falls into this as well. However, once you reach blue belt, you get that blue belt promotion, you're a little bit more on an island. So people fall into the trap of when they're learning a new skill, they lose their autonomy. Right? They're learning the new skill. They don't make a single move unless their instructor tells them to make that move. And what happens is this is a habitual thing. As you advance, you still don't make a move unless your instructor tells you to make that move.
Here's a setup I like. Here, grab the collar. All right, he grabs the collar. Grab my collar with your other hand. My other collar. Perfect. Now we can do it.
Even though you're getting better, even though you're flowing a lot better, even though you're rolling a lot better, all of these things are happening, you're still not learning that autonomy. You're not taking it upon yourself to improve. So when you get to blue belt, your instructor lays off a little bit. You're doing a lot less learning. It's more refinery. And you obviously refine your game all the way through black belt, but it's refinery. So, but here's what we talked about before, expectation. As a blue belt, you expect to be better. You expect to, and you'll give yourself benchmarks. You'll be like, well, I'm a blue belt now. I'm a blue belt now. I should be submitting people. I used to not submit people because in white, I was a white belt, but now I'm a blue belt. I should be submitting white belts. I should be doing this. I should be doing that. You know,
so that belt hierarchy is a very powerful motivator, and it can also be a very powerful distraction in many ways. I would be interesting to know if there's anything comparable in the sport of weightlifting. I know there's no belt ranks, but I am really curious about that.
That absolutely happens. There's no belt ranking, right? But it absolutely happens in weightlifting. So even, and it might even be a little bit faster, but what's funny is it takes about 2 years to get your blue belt, I think, right? Wouldn't you say like
roughly,
more or less 2 years, okay? In weightlifting, the amount of time it takes the average person to go from beginner to intermediate to now pushing towards advanced is about 2 years as well. And that, again, this is one of those things, this is too broad of a paint, you know, we're painting very broad strokes here, but being advanced weightlifter can take you 10 years to become elite, right? You know, it's like, it's the same exact idea as blue belt to black belt. So what happens in weightlifting is, okay, coach, I don't know how to snatch at all. So you teach them how to snatch. I don't know how to clean and jerk at all. You teach them how to clean and jerk. I don't know how to program anything. So you program for them. I don't know how to fix my pull. So you fix their pull. Right? You do this repeatedly and they improve. And they're like, God, I love this coach. He's doing everything for me. He's doing all this. It's great. It's blah, 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 blah. They get to that point where they're like, coach, I haven't improved in a while. What's going on? It must be your fault, right? Because I'm listening to you. And when I listen to you, you're not improving me. I'm not improving, right? And so what you see is a big
I feel like
drop
I've
off.
had this exact discussion with some of the athletes I've coached. Not about
Yeah.
weightlifting, but combat sports, man. Almost word for word. But yeah,
Yes.
go on, man.
So that is the blue belt blues, but in weightlifting. And that is, Ramsey, the core of this is the psychology that needs to be developed, or else you will not make it past, right? That part of the triad, the psychology is incredibly important. And so how do we develop that psychology? Well, so there's another triad, we'll call them the 3 A's. That is autonomy, auto-regulation, and accountability. So they all kind of feed into each other, but the one that I like the most is autonomy. And that's the idea that your improvement, your development, the majority of it needs to come from within. No matter what your skill level, your motivation, your understanding, your learning needs to come from within.
Right.
And that is something that I cannot tell you it is one of the most important things when you're picking up anything, is knowing that there is someone to help you, but that's simply it. They're helping you. They are not you. So in jiu-jitsu, like, I go home, I have a flow grappling account. All of my YouTube algorithm is jiu-jitsu. I have friends at home who do jiu-jitsu. We talk on the phone almost daily after practice about, oh man, I did this, I did that. He's like, oh, but you should have tried this. You should have tried that. You know, that's my autonomy. I love this shit. Rodrigo doesn't have to tell me anything if he doesn't want to. I know that he's there and he can teach me things, and he teaches the class, and I love him for that. But I would never put my improvement on the back of Rodrigo. Never. You know, that's just not who I am. So that's autonomy. Auto-regulation is understanding now how we can work recovery into that. So auto-regulating the actual fatigue that you give yourself, understanding how many times to train, you know, taking your recovery into account, sleep, nutrition, all of these different things that you yourself are regulating, because it is actually physically impossible for your sensei or instructor or professor to control. You need to learn how to auto-regulate. And then finally, it's accountability. So you are the one that has to hold yourself accountable. Whereas a lot of times we come from backgrounds in school and in other team sports, we have other people hold us accountable. So our professor in school would hold us accountable. He or she would say, if you don't show up, you get a bad grade. It's as simple as that. That's me holding you accountable. Well, in my school of jiu-jitsu, if you don't show up, nothing happens. No one cares. You know, no one gives a shit if you're there or not. And that's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing. I give a shit if I'm not there. I care. I don't want to miss training because I feel like I'll be missing out. I feel like I'll be missing an opportunity to get better. So those 3 aspects need to be understood. They need to be developed consistently before we can start worrying about, oh, am I strong enough, or do I have a good enough technique?
I love that. I love that so much. It's one of the big differences between old school traditional martial arts, as I practice them, and modern combat sports. You know, in the old school taekwondo, karate, judo schools, you showed up like a minute late or something, there was punishment. You had to do a bunch of push-ups. They'd slap you with a stick or something. And today, my students, sometimes my athletes, they'll come in late and they'll be like, "I'm so sorry, coach. I'm like, you know, the official policy is get warmed up, say hi, and join the class." And they're like expecting me to dole out some sort of punishment. I'm like, you missed the warm up, you missed the instruction. That's the punishment.
Yeah.
So
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So the reason why, and this is, I just want to say for your viewers, the reason why I talk about psychology is because you simply cannot ever say which one is better, technique or strength. Like I can't see myself answering that ever. Yes. I've seen bodybuilders come into jiu-jitsu places. I'm sure a lot of people, and they're not athletes. You know, they're just big and strong. They're just not athletes. I I myself, have submitted people with 10 years of experience in this sport because they're not as strong as me, that it doesn't matter. None of it matters. We can never, ever have a rule set of be this strong and you'll beat this technical, be this technical.
Exactly.
And you'll beat this, that's why we fight, so we can see who's better. That's why we do it.
Exactly.
Let's stop trying to determine it before it happens.
Yes, there are as many variables in this equation as there are human beings. And there are so many anecdotes. I mean, there were so many anecdotes in the comments section of that commentary video on your role, from people saying, yeah, well, I knew this big, strong power lifter, and I rolled with him and I beat him, and I'm just a little guy. And of course that happens. I had a student for about 8 years. He came into my gym and he was about 130 kilos, just a big, strong, I forgot how to use U.S. customary units. I apologize. 130 kilos.
Or something.
Yeah, yes, just big, strong guy. Power lifter type of guy. Had this, I don't remember his exact numbers, but just huge numbers on the squat and deadlift. And I didn't think too much of it because, he didn't look that imposing because he was kind of tall. And that's the thing about tall guys. And this is one thing that attracted me to your channel specifically, because you're a tall guy and I'm kind of a tall guy. And I was getting all these lifting cues from these short people, and it just didn't really click. And then I noticed your channel was like, this guy gets it. This guy understands my particular physiology. So again, that's one of the reasons why I love your channel so much, is because you address issues like that. Like, what do you do if you have long femurs, for example? Mm-hmm. But as soon as I got on the mat with this guy, like no jiu-jitsu training, no martial arts training, no wrestling. He did play football. He was an incredible athlete. We start to roll. I catch him in an armbar. He curls my arm back up and tosses me across the room, climbs on top, puts one hand across my head, starts crushing my skull. I try to pry it off. He has me pinned with just the one arm. I'm like, I've never felt anything like this before. I've never felt this level of physical strength. What is going on? Eventually, I had to tap out to just brute force. And it was shocking to me. Because again, I'd rolled with a lot of strong guys, but nothing like that before.
Right.
And I had never really gotten deep into strength training at all. Like I didn't regularly squat or deadlift or do a lot of pull-ups or anything like that. But I had a chat with him afterward, like, what's your secret? What's your secret? And disappointingly, the secret was hard work over long periods of time consistently.
Yeah.
I was like, oh man, maybe I'll give that a try for real this time. But man, that was absolutely life-changing to me. Absolutely life-changing.
So many people have those stories, man, and the reverse is always true. I'm sure had you rolled again with him that day, you'd be a little bit more prepared. If he,
sure,
you would have different escapes, you would have different submissions in mind, and you would adapt and you would change. Just right there, you would have to have some sort of grit to be like, hey, I'm an experienced BJJ practitioner, and this guy came in first day, and I had to submit, and you would be like pissed because you're like, this guy's not better than me, but in reality, you just come back and roll again. That's the beautiful thing about a tap, is that there's nothing, no harm, no foul.
Yeah. It's like what you were saying about humility, man.
Yeah, I love the tap. Yeah. It's great because it just means, hey, let's do this again. Let's try again. So yeah, and I kind of want to dive into just something a little bit, again, the ins and outs of strength training and why they're important. But I want to do it in a way that I can package without boring you and or your viewers.
By all means.
So one of the things that that people need to understand about specificity and technique is that, just like anything, it has a point of diminishing returns. And it's something that this is where the psychology comes in again. Knowing that you're good at something and knowing what it would take to make you better at it would far outweigh the actual getting better at it. That's usually what diminishing returns would entail. So let's think about it like this in the terms of the deadlift or the back squat.
Okay.
Let's say that you haven't really deadlifted at all in your life. You come into the gym, someone teaches you how to deadlift, you maybe do 60 kilos for a set of 5. Okay. The next week you can come in and you do 5 sets of 5 at 60. That's what we would call the principle of overload. So you're now overloading your physiology so you can make an adaptation and get better. That person, their adaptive resistance to the deadlift is almost non-existent. So anything they do, they're going to get better at deadlifting, right? Now, let's take that person and fast forward 10 years. And that person's deadlift is now 600 pounds, or let's say 660 pounds. So it can be a flat 300 kilo deadlift. That's a very strong deadlift. Now, in order to make that person better at deadlifting, through deadlifting, is going to be a very, very hard process. Very hard. Because now their adaptive resistance has been built up to the deadlift. So in order to push past that now harder barrier to pass, you have to do more work. When you do more work, you aren't able to do another thing, which is fatigue management. And we'll call that, that's another principle. You're not able to manage your fatigue. And what happens? You get injured. Right. So that is the idea of specificity. So we're specifically attacking something with the sole purpose of having some sort of response, some sort of physiological response, and some sort of adaptation. We'll call that stimulus recovery adaptation. Stimulus recovery adaptation. Now that process is, again, you have to learn how to mitigate any sort of issues that can stem from that process. And so this is what the Soviets kind of understood early on, is that in order to develop an athlete, we need to develop general physical qualities, things that are outside of their specific task, because we have this adaptive resistance that's continually built up. And in order to push past this adaptive resistance, we're injuring our athletes. So take the jiu-jitsu practitioner. They practice for 7 years, 8 years. They go 7 days a week, and they want to get better at jiu-jitsu. Well, what do? 9 days a week? Or sorry, 9 times a week? 10 sessions a week? How do we get better? Oh, well, we just got to train harder. Well, that's not always it. You have to be like, well, what are my physical limitations? And
there's a point of diminishing returns there.
Yes. Do I need to do jiu-jitsu to improve upon those limitations? And the answer is almost always going to be no. You're going to keep doing jiu-jitsu so you don't decay in your abilities in jiu-jitsu, right? But you don't need to do as much. You don't need to take out of that recovery cup. So, say that your ability to recover is a glass. We don't want to take up all of that with jiu-jitsu, because we want to be able to develop other qualities. Like we said, if you're weak, we need to develop your strength. So that's where these physical qualities come into play. And that's where people who are listening, they need to understand, depending on your skill level, you need to focus on developing other qualities so that you can always come back to that skill that you want to do. People find themselves as 160 pounds, purple belt, submitting the shit out of everyone in training, and then they'll go to a tournament and they'll lose. And because they love that feeling of being good in training and submitting everyone in training, they're not going to change their training. They're not going to change their perspective and say, you know what? I'm not going to do jiu-jitsu 7 times this week. I'm actually only going to do it 3 times. And if I do it a 4th or a 5th, I'm going to roll lightly and just relax and calm down. That's that humility. That's that psychology, Ramsey. This is why this is so important, is people needing to check their ego and work on other things. So
man, it's so fascinating, because in martial arts culture, if you will, we always talk about humility, but it's so often a facade. Like how often have I heard martial arts instructors preach to me and to others about humility, be humble, empty your glass, whatever. But the actual willingness to step outside your paradigm and do something different is so often not there. So, man, I love what you're bringing to the table here.
Yeah, and so here's another example. Myself, I'm doing the exact opposite. For everyone watching and who thinks I'm a strong guy, you have not seen what, my strength levels were vastly higher than they are now. Why? Because of what I talked about before, adaptive resistance, stimulus recovery, adaptation. I simply cannot maintain the strength or get stronger than where I was while also trying to optimize my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It is physically impossible. It is absolutely fit. This is another principle, which is specific adaptations to impose demands. Our bodies are going to adapt to whatever we specifically give it, right?
Exactly.
But it will not optimize towards anything. Again, it's a cup. If we take this much out of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, then we take this much out of weightlifting, right? If you can't see, sorry, half of the cup would go to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, half of it would go to weightlifting. Now, the interesting thing about that is you're not optimizing either of them, because you're just going to be average at weightlifting and average at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So for me, it's like I'm getting weaker every day. I know that, but I'm getting better at Jiu-Jitsu every day. And that's totally fine.
It's a different type of strength, if you will.
Honest to God, I have made that sacrifice. I go into the gym and I actually get outlifted by some of my students, by some of my athletes who would never outlift me in a million years, right? But I don't care. I don't need to prove to them consistently that I'm better than them.
Yeah, that's very similar to the paradigm of being a mixed martial artist. Because as a mixed martial artist, you're not going to be the best boxer. You're not going to be the best jiu-jitsu guy. You're not going to be the best Muay Thai fighter. But in order to be the best mixed martial artist, you have to sacrifice your time because you can't devote it to specificity in all of those areas. So that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. Yes. And, there's another paradigm there as well, is that you might have to become specifically good at something so you can kind of check the box, if you will, on that thing. And it might not always work like that, but you might have to just take a devoted amount of time and be good at grappling and just not really focus on striking or even fighting in the style of mixed martial arts. Like, that might be an option for you to just be a grappler. You tell a kid who's 15 years old who wants to be an MMA fighter, you say, hey, why don't you get good at something? Get good at something before you get average at everything. So.
Yeah, man, absolutely. I pulled aside a number of athletes who love sparring, and all they want to do is bang every day. They want to come into the gym and spar and just scrap, UFC rules basically. And I'm like, hold on, what you really need to do is improve your boxing footwork. And they're like, oh, but that's boring, right? I'm like, that's what you need to win fights at this moment in your life. We have to get really specific. But I love how you put it, like more rolling. It's great to a point, but again, there's a point of diminishing returns and how much that's going to affect your skill at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
This is something I've said to my lifters, and this is so silly. If I go, snatching more isn't going to make you snatch more.
that kind of makes sense in a weird way, but
rolling more isn't going to make you better at rolling. Sometimes, right? Again, everyone listening, that is such a. I'm always the guy. I'll argue against the points that I've made prior because I'm so scared of being pegged as an absolutist, someone who just is like totally entrenched in one idea being the only idea. So for a lot of people, rolling more is going to help you. But I work with, Andrew Tackett, William Tackett, Kody Steele. That's not always the case. It really isn't. There are times with these guys who are incredibly technically sound, where their fitness isn't up to the other person's fitness, or their strength isn't up to the other person's strength. So actually rolling less and being able to recover and relax. Like recovery is just the most important thing for an elite athlete. And if you're building a quality in some place, that comes with recovery demands. So say you're getting stronger, you need to recover from those strength training sessions, not go and roll, because the way that these guys roll, watching them roll it's different, right? I'm sure you're well aware of this. You're right.
Some guys roll to the death, man. Some guys roll to the death.
Yes, the costs of them rolling on their body is going to be higher than the cost of your average white belt. So
for sure,
just understanding that balance it's so important.
Stay tuned for part 2 coming up soon. And thanks again to the channel sponsor, Nogi, BJJgear.com. Go check them out for awesome rash guards, spats, shorts, and more. Don't forget to use my code Ramsey10 for a 10% discount off everything on the website. That's NogiBJJgear.com.